Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of your course. So if you remember last week in kind of talking through what's to come in this course, I showed you a chart of the organization of all of the topics that we're going to talk about. And I explained that we're going to start by talking about the outcomes that organizations are most interested in, or in other words, the reasons why we should invest in organizational behavior. Now, again, if you remember this chart, there are two focal outcomes that organizations care about: job attitudes and job behaviors. So we're going to start off the class by talking about these two critical outcomes. And today we're going to get started by talking about job attitudes and why they're so important to organizations. Hopefully by the end of today, or by the end of you viewing this lecture, we'll have a better understanding of why organizations invest so much in sort of cultivating particular attitudes among their employees. You remember this chart that I showed you from last week when I was giving you an introduction to the course and kind of laying the foundation of what we're going to cover. And I want to present this again to you so we can situate sort of where we are and where we're going. So if you look all the way at the end of this chart here on the right-hand side, we have these key outcomes that we care about in organizational behavior. And I defined organizational behavior as a field of study that tries to understand and improve these key outcomes. So what we're going to do in this course is actually start by talking about these outcomes. I want to sort of ground you to the outcomes that we care about, how we measure them, how we attend to them, and of course their importance so that we know exactly why organizational behavior is centered around these different outcomes. And then we're going to back up and talk about all of the determinants of these outcomes and ways that organizational behavior can be applied to improve these different outcomes. But one of our key outcomes is job attitudes. So that's where we're going to start today. And then of course, next week, we're going to talk about job behavior. These two things are certainly related and are kind of two halves of the same whole. But we're going to start by thinking about how employees feel at work. To kind of formalize our agenda for today, we're going to start off by talking about the components of an attitude, so we know exactly what an attitude is and how it's formulated. We're also going to talk about an important difference in how we tend to formulate attitudes broadly and how we tend to think about job attitudes specifically. Then we're going to focus in and identify some specific job attitudes that organizations care about. And here there are tons of different job attitudes, but we're going to focus in on the two that matter the most. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the antecedents of job attitudes, or what leads people to feel particular ways at work. And then we'll also talk about the outcomes of attitudes, or why attitudes are important to study and how they lead to downstream effects for both employees and for firms. All right, so jumping right into our content here, I want to again start by defining exactly what an attitude is. And very broadly defined, when we're thinking about attitudes in general, we're talking about a relatively lasting evaluation of people, objects, or issues. And here, of course, we're talking about this lasting and complex evaluation of one's job, of one's organization. And I want to be really clear here that attitudes are really complicated because they encompass a lot of different information that we have to synthesize together to come up with one evaluation of that particular target, or one evaluation of our job. Now, attitudes can encompass things like our appraisals of virtually every aspect of our job, right? So it's everything we think about our job, everything that we feel towards our job, or everything that we feel when we're actually physically present at our job. And it's also a reflection of all of our experiences with our organization or with the people in it. So we would reflect on all of the experiences we've had at work, all of the experiences we've had with our coworkers, all of the experiences we've had with our supervisors, and try to put all of that together. So really a job attitude is this really complex reflection back on our entire experience with our job or with our organization, and then this integration of all of that information into one appraisal. And here I want to be really clear about the different components of an attitude, and we tend to use what we call the tripartite model of attitudes to recognize that there are three distinct components of an attitude. Tripartite is just a fancy way of saying there are three components. And I like to refer to this as the ABC model because I think that makes it a little bit easier to remember. So for all attitudes, there's this affective component, that's the A. There's this behavioral component, that's the B. And there's a cognitive component, that's the C. The affective component is how we feel towards work or how we feel when we're at work. The behavioral component is how we behave towards the target or how we behave at work or towards other people that we work with, like our coworkers and our supervisor. And then the cognitive component is everything we believe to be true of our work. This might reflect an appraisal of something like whether we think our organization is fair, whether we think our job is meaningful, right? Any of those cognitive evaluations that we make of the work itself or of our job or organization would fall into that cognitive piece. Now, as I foreshadowed here, this is how we generally think of an attitude, but there is one really important departure in how we think about and measure job attitudes. When we're thinking about job attitudes, we really only focus in on the affective and the cognitive piece. And the reason why is not because we think behaviors aren't important. It's actually the opposite. It's that we think behaviors are so important that we want to measure them separately. So that's why we have an entire separate section next week on job behaviors. But I want to just make it clear here that when we measure job attitudes or think about job attitudes, we are just focusing in on how employees feel and the appraisals of their work that underlie those feelings. All right, so as I said up front, there are a ton of different job attitudes that organizations could be interested in. But this week, we're going to focus in on the two that are most important. And these are the two that are most closely related to other outcomes that we care about, like firm performance and employee well-being. And those two job attitudes that we're going to focus in on are job satisfaction and organizational commitment. And we're going to start with job satisfaction because this is kind of the quintessential job attitude and certainly the job attitude that we study the most, that we measure the most among employees, that we talk about the most, care about the most, and is most strongly related to those outcomes that we care about. That, of course, begs the question of what is job satisfaction? And I think in a lot of ways, job satisfaction is probably self-evident just from the label of job satisfaction. But to define it very formally for you, job satisfaction is a positive emotional state resulting from the appraisal of one's job or job experiences. And again, here, I want to key into both the emotional or affective component and cognitive component here because both of these are represented. Some people tend to think that job satisfaction is simply how happy employees are when they're at work or when they think about their jobs, but really this is both emotional and cognitive. That means that we first make appraisals about our job, right? We might think about whether our job is fair, whether we're valued at our work, whether our organization is ethical. And from those different appraisals of our job, that's going to inform how we feel when we engage in work, how we feel when we reflect on work. So both of these are interrelated, right? We probably start with these cognitive appraisals and that informs our emotional piece. And both of those are captured when we measure job satisfaction. Now, broadly speaking, when organizations measure job satisfaction, they tend to measure what we call global satisfaction, or how satisfied people are with their jobs as a whole. But it might also be advantageous to understand how satisfied employees are with specific components of their job. And when we tend to take that approach, we focus in on some very specific components of the job, which include pay, promotions, how satisfied we are with our coworkers and our supervisor, the people we interact with at work, and then how satisfied we are with the work itself. Now, I want to sort of ask you to pause here and reflect on which of these facets you think might be most strongly related to global satisfaction. Another way of thinking about this is if you think about what kind of job would make you satisfied, which of these would drive how satisfied you are, or which of these would drive that more than the others? All right, hopefully you've had a chance to reflect on that question a little bit and think about how these facets might relate to global job satisfaction. But here I want to give you the formal answer based on the data. So when we ask people how satisfied they are with their jobs as a whole, and then we ask them how satisfied with their jobs in terms of these very specific facets, and we look at the correlation between those two things, global satisfaction and satisfaction between each specific facet, here's what we find. And some of this might be a little bit surprising, or does tend to be surprising to students. And in particular, the first couple here depicted in the graph, pay and promotion. We actually see relatively weak correlations between pay satisfaction in particular and promotion satisfaction to some degree as well, and global satisfaction. That means that how much we're paid at work and how satisfied we are with our pay actually doesn't contribute a whole lot to how satisfied we are with our jobs as a whole. And again, I think that counters a lot of lay ideas that we have about these sort of structural outcomes and their role in job satisfaction. Then when we get into how satisfied we are with the people that we work with, we see that that's much more significantly related to how satisfied we are with our jobs as a whole. We have correlations at about 0.5, so those are pretty strong relationships there. But of course, the strongest relationship that we see in this graph is the relationship between the work itself and job satisfaction. What this means is that when employees are reflecting on how satisfied they are with their jobs, they're making these appraisals and they're thinking about how they feel when they're at work. The work that they're actually doing, the tasks that they're actually given to do, and the ways that they're spending their time is the most important determinant of how satisfied they are. And from an organization's perspective, we can learn a lot from this particular finding, because this tells us that if we want to maximize job satisfaction, if we want to make sure that all of our employees are satisfied and therefore are sort of thriving on the job, we need to really care about the types of things we ask them to do and how we communicate about those tasks, right? We want to make them meaningful, we want to make the work interesting, and we want to communicate how that work fits in with organizational goals. Okay, so now we hopefully have a pretty good understanding of exactly what job satisfaction is. And I want to transition into talking about two theories that try to explain how we come to be satisfied, right? It's not enough for organizations to know if their employees are satisfied or not. We need to understand sort of conceptually how people formulate these ideas of whether they're satisfied or dissatisfied with their jobs. Now, I want to say up front that these two theories take a really different approach to explaining job satisfaction. So I'm going to also ask you to kind of reflect on these theories and which one aligns most with how you might formulate how satisfied you are with a job. Okay, with that backdrop, we're going to talk about our first theory, which is called the value percept theory. And what this theory essentially says is that to understand if an employee is satisfied, we want to first ask them what their values are, what they hope to get out of an organization. And then we want to ask the degree to which the organization meets those different values. For example, we might really value pay, and we might have a number in mind of how much pay we want for us to feel valued at work. And maybe coming out of college or a master's program, we might think $100,000 is what is sort of fair market value for us, our labor, our expertise, etc. So we come in, we value pay, and we expect $100,000. If we get a job right out of college and we actually only make $85,000, that's going to lead to dissatisfaction, according to this theory, because there's a discrepancy between what we value, right? We want $100,000 and what we're actually getting from the organization, which is $85,000. So that discrepancy is going to lead to dissatisfaction. Then we would think about that discrepancy for every value that we bring to the table, everything that we want to get out of our organization. We would think about how much of that we want and how much of that we get. and if there's a discrepancy. Then the final component of this theory is that the degree to which that discrepancy matters depends on how important that value is to us. We might value pay as sort of the number one component of how we evaluate a job, right? Especially for a first job, pay is really important. You've spent lots of time as a college student, maybe got a master's degree or something, not making a ton of money. You want to come out and sort of be financially stable. So it might be the case that pay is the absolute end all be all for you. It's the thing you value the most in your first position. Having that discrepancy of $15,000 is going to lead to much more dissatisfaction if that's true. Now imagine that pay might be the lowest of your values. You care about it. You still think $100,000 is fair, but there are maybe 12 things that you care about more than pay. That would mean that this is going to contribute to dissatisfaction to a much lesser extent, right? That discrepancy exists, but it's not all that important to you. Now, I want to kind of shore up this concept of value so that you understand what employees might value. And here I've put together a non-exhaustive list of the kind of values that employees might bring to the table. And some of those are things like having a high salary that's also secure. We might care about having frequent promotions that are merit-based or based on our abilities. We might care about having good supervisor relations, and we might also want good feedback on our performance and rewards related to good performance. We might want to have enjoyable and responsible coworkers, and so on. So where this theory gets sort of complicated is that we would have to know every single value for every single employee. And we also have to know how important each of those values is to that employee and the degree to which the organization meets each of those values. So I think about this from the employee's perspective. This is a really complex formulation. We ask a very easy question to assess job satisfaction, right? How satisfied are you with your job overall, which makes job satisfaction seem very straightforward. But the mental calculus that's going on behind the scenes is actually extremely complicated. And the reason why that's important is because intervening to improve job satisfaction is thus equally complex, right? This theory, the value percept theory, would say that this has to be an individualized approach where we know what the values are of our individual employees, and we try to improve the organization's ability to meet those specific values for those specific people. All right, now I'm going to introduce our second theory, which I already foreshadowed takes a very different approach to studying job satisfaction. Again, our first theory, our value percept theory, is very individualized. It comes down to an individual employee, their specific values, their specific perceptions of the organization, and their value or importance that they place on those specific values. Our second theory is a little bit more straightforward because it isn't personalized, and it basically says that we can take one singular approach to maximizing satisfaction for all employees. This theory is called the job characteristics model, and sort of the heart of this model or this theory is that jobs are more intrinsically enjoyable when tasks are challenging and fulfilling. In other words, employees are going to be satisfied, they're going to max out their satisfaction when we create actual work tasks that are challenging, that are fulfilling, that have clear meaning to employees. And this certainly aligns with that chart that I just showed you, which shows that the work itself is really what drives global satisfaction. Now, to dig in a little bit deeper to this theory, what the theory says is that there are 5 core job characteristics, or 5 components of our job, that combine to make some jobs more rewarding than others. I think an easier way of stating this is that there are 5 core job characteristics where if we maximize those, we can maximize job satisfaction. So, of course, we have to answer what are those 5 core job characteristics. And those 5 characteristics are task identity, task significance, skill variety, autonomy, and feedback. Task identity is all about being able to see work from beginning to end. And this is really about giving people a sense of ownership over the work that they do. As you can probably imagine, if we only contribute a small piece to something, maybe we work on an assembly line and we have the first step in producing a product. So we have to do the same thing over and over, but we never actually get to see a fully assembled product. It's really hard to feel ownership over the work that you're doing. And it might also be hard to see how the piece that you're responsible for adds up to a whole. So anywhere we can, we want to be able to make that really salient to employees, to show them the full task and the full product that's being produced. Then we have task significance, and this is all about viewing your work as important, viewing your work as meaningful. And of course, we want to try to maximize this by giving people meaningful tasks, right? Things that are kind of inherently exciting or fulfilling or meaningful to them. But we're not always able to do that. The reality is some jobs require pieces of that job that are just not that meaningful. They might be boring, they might be routine, they might be sort of filling out paperwork or doing something that just isn't kind of inherently significant. But what we can do as an organization to overcome that is remind employees how that task, how completing it, adds up to a larger goal or really helps the firm. So we can still find ways to make significance salient, even when we have to do some of these sort of more boring tasks. Then we have skill variety, and this is all about your ability to apply different skills to completing your work. If you go to work and you do one kind of thing over and over and over, and that only engages one skill set that you have, you might experience boredom, right? That's pretty monotonous if you do the same kind of thing over and over. But you also might feel underutilized, like you have all of these other skills and all of these other assets that you could contribute to the organization, but you simply don't have the opportunity to do that, right? People are certainly more satisfied when they get to engage in work in a variety of ways that use their full set of skills. Then we have autonomy, which is all about having some sort of discretion or control. And I think we often think about autonomy in terms of when people work, what their schedule is, having flexibility in taking holidays off or coming in later, having flex days, working remotely, those kinds of things. But we should also recognize that we can grant employees autonomy in how they do their job. And here, a lot of this is recognizing that there are multiple successful pathways through which someone can complete their job. Just because you do it a particular way doesn't mean another employee has to do it in that exact way, and giving people some autonomy over some part of that, either when they do their job, the modality in which they do their job, or how they're able to successfully complete their job can go a long way in creating satisfaction. And then feedback is obviously all about having some sort of knowledge of how well you're doing on the job. And you can imagine that if you were sort of toiling away at work and doing a bunch of things and nobody ever told you if you were doing the right thing or if you were doing that thing particularly well, that might not be very satisfying or motivating, right? Getting feedback is very directive. It helps you understand where you should invest your effort as an employee. And when someone recognizes a job well done, that can be very satisfying. So I just want to show you this figure to kind of formalize the job characteristics model even more here. And what we can see is on the left side, we have our 5 core job characteristics. We have task variety, task identity, skill variety, task identity, task significance, We have autonomy, and then we have feedback from the job. And each of those core job characteristics are going to lead to these critical psychological states. So when we have the variety, identity, significance piece completed, then that helps us experience meaningfulness of our work. When we afford employees autonomy, that helps them experience responsibility for the outcomes of their work. And when we give employees feedback, that helps them have knowledge of the actual results of the work activity, which again is directive and motivating. And all of those psychological states will then lead to these critical outcomes that we care about, including things like high job performance, which we'll talk about next week. But of particular interest to our topic today, this is what's going to lead to high general job satisfaction. So you don't have to know a ton about this. You can definitely ignore the moderator's box at the end, but you should know, again, the general principle behind this model is that if we can max these out, right, if we can give people as much skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback as we possibly can, we're also going to max out job satisfaction. Now, I want you to kind of pause here and reflect on these two theories. Again, they take a very different approach to saying how people are satisfied at work or how they'll identify if they are satisfied at work. And I want you to kind of think about these theories and how they stack up to your own experience. So maybe reflect on a job that you've had or reflect on a job that would make you really satisfied and think about whether you would take this more sort of mathematical approach like the value percept theory, or whether the core job characteristics model captures if you would be satisfied with a job or not. Okay, so shifting away from theory a little bit, I think it's also important to recognize that job satisfaction isn't completely stable. And what I mean by that is that it does fluctuate across time. Now, I understand that we defined an attitude as something that's relatively lasting, right, on that very first slide. But we also know that there are some predictable ways that job satisfaction can ebb and flow over time. And it's not necessarily true that just because an employee is highly satisfied at one time, they're going to remain highly satisfied for all of time. And one of the ways that we know job satisfaction fluctuates in this predictable way over time is through the honeymoon and hangover effect. And this really captures an employee's first few months on the job. So we're thinking about newcomers, people who have just been hired into an organization, and how they experience their job early on. So our first effect is what we call the honeymoon effect, and this happens over the first few months on the job. And what we tend to see is that there's this really high level of job satisfaction, and in particular that people are way more satisfied with their new job than they were with their previous job. And some of this is because we come into a new job with rose-colored glasses, if you will, right? We might sort of be excited about this new job. Everything is new and shiny. We haven't figured out what we don't like about the job yet or what's not a great fit yet. So we come in and we have this really high satisfaction. During this time, we might also be kind of shielded from the worst parts of the job. Sometimes we don't like to throw our newcomers into the deep end, so we might protect them from doing certain things or engaging with the person in the office that we know is maybe not so pleasant. So we protect them from those bad parts, which again allows their satisfaction to be high. Then, unfortunately, what we see is this pretty precipitous or pretty steep drop-off in job satisfaction after those first few months. So like all honeymoon effects, we have this end to our honeymoon and we fall into what we call the hangover effect. And what happens here is we start to learn a little bit more about the job, right? Maybe we take off our rose-colored glasses, we figure out the coworker that we just find very annoying and gets under our skin. We start to learn that certain parts of the job, although they may have seemed appealing at first, are kind of tedious or not a good fit for us. So we start to become more aware. That shield that was placed around us might also disappear, and the organization may kind of push us into doing tasks and engaging with people that they shielded us from before. But now, as we become full members of the organization, we're kind of thrust into that environment. And why we care about this hangover effect is because it's a really steep drop-off, because people are really satisfied and then they get to know more about the organization and become really dissatisfied. People start to feel like their unmet promise here, like they were told that the organization was going to be something and it wasn't, right? That the organization sort of didn't deliver on what they said they were going to do. And that unfortunately leads to a pattern where we have this really high uptick in turnover, right? Where people are dissatisfied with their positions kind of really suddenly. And that means that they're more likely to leave those positions when that hangover effect sets in. Now, just because this is a predictable pattern of how job satisfaction fluctuates over time, it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about it. And one thing organizations can do to help alleviate at least the steepness of this drop off in job satisfaction is to give employees what we call a realistic job preview. That means don't shield them, right? In the interview process, be honest about the good and the bad of a job. And then when employees come in and start that position, don't shield them from the worst parts of it. Sort of give them a full chance to understand and make sense of the position, including the parts that are maybe not as savory as the other parts. When we try to shield them, this is obviously with the best of intentions, but we really exacerbate the likelihood that they're going to hit this hangover effect and hit it hard and then leave the organization because they feel like the organization has sort of duped them a little bit. Then, of course, we can also see fluctuations in job satisfaction even within a single day. And in fact, we do see that job satisfaction ebbs and flows throughout a workday. Now, these ebbs and flows are going to be relatively short-lived, right? They're going to be kind of temporary changes in job satisfaction, but they are important to keep in mind. So here I've kind of reconstructed a workday for you so that we can think through how job satisfaction might shift across the day. So let's say we come in at 8 a.m. when work starts, and we're just doing some basic tasks. We're answering some emails, and our job satisfaction is not super high, but we're pretty satisfied. Then as we're doing that task, we read an annoying email from our boss. Maybe they're sort of hounding us about something that isn't our responsibility. So then our job satisfaction is going to plummet, right? We get annoyed at that email, so all of a sudden we're not very satisfied. Then we might start to level out just a little bit, but we're still kind of sitting in this dissatisfaction. But then we might have a funny conversation with a friend, right? We bump into a coworker at the water cooler. They tell us something funny. We feel connected to our colleagues, and that's going to bump our job satisfaction back up. And we're going to sit there a little bit, but then maybe something happens during lunch where we had to leave our lunch early to return to work because somebody asked us to do a task really quickly and unexpectedly. So that's going to dip our job satisfaction down a little bit. But then as we're working on that task, we realize that it's really interesting and really challenging, and we really like this new project. So the task itself is giving us a lot of meaning. So that's going to increase our satisfaction. And then at the end of the day, we might get this phone call saying that there's some paperwork that's overdue, and we have to suddenly shift away from this task that we find really meaningful and do something that we find really boring. So our job satisfaction is going to plummet again. Right, so this is just an example of how job satisfaction might ebb and flow throughout the day. Again, these changes are relatively temporary, but they're still really important for how employees experience their work days. And they're clearly tethered to something in particular. And that something in particular is how we feel, right? We're experiencing these fluctuations in job satisfaction across our workday because we're experiencing different emotions and moods that are affecting how we feel on the job. And here, to dig into this a little bit, I want to differentiate between an emotion and a mood because they're both important for determining our job satisfaction, and as organizations, we should care a lot about how our employees feel on the job. But these words are tended to use sort of interchangeably, and they mean something different, right? Again, they're both important, but they are important to keep separate. So first we have an emotion, and an emotion is a specific feeling that's precipitated by a specific event. So something happens and that provokes a very specific, discrete feeling. And that feeling that we have is intense enough to disrupt our thought processes, meaning it's going to direct all of our attention to how we're feeling in the event that led to us feeling that way, and sort of siphon all of our resources away from being able to do work tasks. A good example of this is, let's say we're interacting with a coworker and that coworker yells at us, right? They get angry and they start yelling at us. That's a very specific event that's probably going to trigger something like anger or frustration. And when we're in that state of anger, that's very acute. We feel that very intensely. So that's going to make it really difficult to then sit back at our desk and do our work, right? Instead of thinking about work, we're going to be really cognitively distracted, thinking about what the coworker said to us, what we could have said back to them, and sort of what led to it and how you're going to resolve it and all sorts of things, right? Then mood is different in that mood is kind of more diffuse. So I tend to think of mood as background music. Mood is a more generalized state of feeling that doesn't tend to be elicited by a specific event. So there's no specific trigger for that emotion, and we may simply wake up in a good mood or wake up in a bad mood. And it tends, again, to be diffuse, meaning it's not this intense, acute experience like the anger in response to someone yelling at us, but we're still aware of it. And so it can still affect our day, it can still affect our work, but it's not going to interrupt our ability to do our job. So because emotions are so acute and because they do have this really great power to disrupt our thought processes and distract us from our work, we tend to focus in on emotions over moods and how they relate to things like job satisfaction and job performance. They certainly have a stronger relationship with job satisfaction as compared to mood. And that's led us to really want to classify different discrete emotions that people can experience at work and their effects, again, for job attitudes and job behaviors. Now, this is one way that we classify emotions, and this is certainly the most common way that we classify emotions. And here, this is called the affective circumplex. So if on an exam you see the term affective circumplex, I'm referring to this figure, this sort of circle of emotions. And what this categorization system says is that we can think about discrete emotions as falling somewhere along two different dimensions. Our first dimension is valence, so sort of how pleasant or unpleasant an emotion is. And of course, something like happiness would be pleasantly valenced or positively valenced, and something like being sad would be unpleasantly or negatively valenced. So I think valence is pretty obvious here. And then our second dimension here, which runs from top to bottom of the affective circumplex, is what we call activation. Or another way of thinking about this is arousal, right? How much activation or how much arousal does an emotion elicit? And here, high activation or high arousal emotions are emotions that propel us toward an action. And low activation or low arousal emotions are emotions that propel us away from action. As a good example, let's think about anger, right? When we get angry at somebody, we have high activation, high arousal. We want to do something about that anger. We have an attitude. We want to, tell somebody exactly what we think. We want to be able to respond. We want to be able to retaliate, right? We are motivated to do something back to the person who made us angry. Now, if we think about something like feeling relaxed, feeling quiet, feeling calm, that's on the low end of activation and arousal. That actually makes us want to do nothing in particular, right? When you're relaxed, you kind of just want to melt into your couch and not really do anything. So that's not propelling us toward any action, and it actually might propel us away from engaging in any action. So the reason why this is important or informative for us is that we know that emotions that fall into these different quadrants of our affective circumplex have different relationships with job satisfaction and things like job performance. The best case scenario is a high activation or high arousal positive emotion. So something that is positively valenced and high in activation, like happiness, right? That is something that we want being enthusiastic, I think, is a better example of a high activation, highly positive emotional state. That's what we want for job satisfaction. It's going to have the strongest positive relationship with job satisfaction, and it also has the strongest positive relationship with performance. Then sort of the next best option is a low activation positive emotion, so feeling something like content. This actually tends to have a pretty weak relationship with job satisfaction and a pretty weak relationship with job performance. So although this is a positive emotion, it doesn't necessarily get us as much benefit as feeling these high arousal or high activation emotions. And then our sort of third best option is a low activation, negatively valenced emotion. So when we think about sort of being bored or something like that, it's on the unpleasant side, but it's not really propelling us toward engaging in bad behavior. And then the worst for job satisfaction and the worst for performance is when we have these high activation negative emotions. So if you feel angry, as a good example, that's going to make you extremely dissatisfied with your job and might actually take you away from performance and toward negative behaviors like engaging in hostility towards your coworkers. So here, it's not enough to make people feel good at work. We want to make sure that people feel high activation positive emotions at work in order to maximize job satisfaction. Then, of course, as we know, and as we've just illustrated, there are a ton of emotionally provocative stimuli that employees experience at work, and those can be positive or negative, and they can sort of hit you at any point in your workday. We might get a promotion at work, which would lead to probably some pretty elevated positive emotions, or we could have a customer yell at us, and that would lead to some pretty significant negative emotions, right? And we might experience both of those things in the same day. So we are going to have these fluctuations that are important for experience of work and our job satisfaction. But we also might find ourselves in the position of experiencing particular emotions or moods that aren't congruent with a work environment or aren't things that we're allowed to openly express at work. And when that happens, we're engaging in what's called emotional labor. We have to invest some sort of energy into changing at least the emotion that we're expressing at work to adhere with what we tend to call display rules, right? A display rule is an expectation of how an employee shows up emotionally at work. And I think a great example of a display rule is something like service with a smile. If you've ever worked in customer service, you know that the expectation is that regardless of how that customer is behaving and how out of pocket they are being in that interaction, your job is to smile through it and be happy to help them no matter what they're asking you for. That's a clear display rule. The rule from the organization is that you must show happiness when interacting with that customer, and you can certainly never show that you are angry. You can certainly never show that you are frustrated or anything outside of just being smiley and bubbly and happy to be there. Now, this emotional labor is also really important for our job satisfaction because when we have to invest our resources into overcoming negative emotions, that starts to become a very negative experience for us at work. But there are different forms of emotional labor, and they're not equally costly. So our first form of emotional labor is what we call surface acting. And this is where we just sort of plaster that smile on our face during that difficult customer interaction, even though we feel terribly and we are really upset with this customer. We really want to just yell at them back because they're yelling at us. But instead, we sit there and we smile through while thinking how horrible of a person they are in our own heads. So we still feel angry, but we're not displaying anger. Deep acting is sort of the opposite approach, where we actually change what we're feeling. So in a case where we might initially feel angry because a customer is yelling at us, and that's a pretty valid emotional response to that, we might try in the moment to get rid of that anger and work through the anger. So instead of just plastering the smile on our face, we actually try to change how we're feeling in that interaction. Now, deep acting is not an easy feat. It is not easy in the face of an anger-inducing interaction to just not be angry and to change the way that we feel. But one of the ways that we can do this is through empathy, right? Trying to sort of empathize with the customer's position and think, maybe they're having a terrible day. Maybe this is the 10th thing that's gone wrong for them. So yes, they're yelling at me, but that's because of everything else that's gone on in their lives. Or reflecting on times that maybe we've lost our temper with customer service employees, even though it wasn't their fault, and trying to find some capacity for understanding where they're coming from. And that might help us overcome the anger, put it aside, and that becomes less laborious over time because it's way harder to smile through anger, right, than it is to smile when you're not feeling anger. So here, the best case scenario is definitely deep acting. When we engage in a lot of surface acting, it's not particularly effective, right? We're not particularly good at displaying emotions that we're not feeling so people can sort of see through them. And this also is a big hit to our job satisfaction. It's a big hit to our well-being and our health, and it also is worse for performance. When we deep act, this can help us remain satisfied, right? Not really dip our job satisfaction quite as much because we're not just feeling that anger on the job, we're actually feeling more positively. And this is certainly better for health and well-being and better for performance as well. Okay, so I've given you a ton of information about job satisfaction here. We went through what job satisfaction is, the types of facets that we tend to measure within job satisfaction, stacked up two theories against each other on how people might formulate how satisfied they are so that we can think about how organizations can maximize satisfaction. And then, of course, talked about how it can fluctuate over time and the really important connection between emotions and job satisfaction. So we're going to put job satisfaction aside now and transition into talking about our second primary job attitude, which is organizational commitment. So here we're going to define what organizational commitment is broadly and then talk about some specific ways that people can be committed to their jobs. Okay, so starting at the top, thinking about what organizational commitment means broadly. Commitment is defined as a desire on the part of the employee to remain a member of the organization. So whereas job satisfaction is really about how pleasant one feels when they're on their job because they're reflecting on their job experiences in a pleasant way, organizational commitment is really more about attachment, right? It's about wanting to be a member of an organization and to continue on with your relationship with that organization. And although commitment is sort of broadly about this idea of wanting to remain with the organization, there are different ways that people can be committed to their organizations or different reasons why employees might want to stay within that organization. And the type of commitment that leads an employee to stay is important. And I really want to drive this point home, simply because we don't have retention and turnover issues, right? We don't have this sort of mass exodus from our organization. Doesn't necessarily mean that employees are happy or want to be there. And it's possible that employees become committed to their organizations for different reasons. So that's why we're going to talk about these different forms of commitment and what kinds of commitment we most want amongst our employees. And before I give you the formal definitions or tell you the ways that we think about this in the literature, I want to first ask you a question, right? So let's say that you're currently employed by a company and you've worked there for maybe the last 5 years or so, but you've been approached by a competing organization and offered a new job with a very competitive salary. I want you to think about this scenario and sort of ask yourself, why might you stay with your current organization? What are all of the reasons you can think of that might lead you to choose to reject this offer and stay rather than taking the shiny new job? So keeping those answers in mind that hopefully you've had some time to formulate, I think it's probably pretty clear that there are really different reasons why employees might choose to remain with an organization. And again, that these different reasons are really important for how people experience work. So I want to put some formal names to these different reasons, at least in the way that we conceptualize them in the literature. And our first form of commitment is what we call affective commitment. An affective commitment here is again just referring to an emotional commitment. So the name again really gives this away. Affective means emotional, because this form of commitment is all about having this emotional attachment to the organization. And it really stems from feeling a strong identification with the organization. So you kind of internalize being a member of the organization as part of your identity, and feeling this strong sort of affection to the organization, right? These are the people who love their jobs and will sort of recruit new people to work and tell them how much they love it any chance that they get. Another way of thinking about this form of commitment in a more informal way is that when people have high affective commitment, they're staying in their organization because they actually like the job. Now, as you can imagine, employees who are highly satisfied tend to also have high affective commitment. They like their jobs, right? They appraise it in this positive way cognitively, so they want to stay put. So there's a very clear interrelationship here between job satisfaction and affective commitment. Then our second type of commitment is what we call continuance commitment. And continuance commitment is more about the perceived investment in the organization or the perceived cost of leaving. In other words, employees experience continuance commitment when they want to stay with the organization because they're aware that leaving would be costly in some way. And in other words, you basically just stay because you need the job. There are so many reasons why people might experience continuance commitment. If there's high unemployment and they perceive that finding a new job would be really difficult, that's a reason why, even if you don't like the job, you might choose to stay. If you have just extremely good job security at your particular position, again, you may not like it, but you may want to stay because you can't match that job security somewhere else. It could be something like your partner has a fantastic job in the area, and if you were to take a new job, you'd have to move across the country, and you simply don't want to do that because it's too high a cost for your partner. So again, even if the job isn't the most satisfying for you, even if you don't necessarily love going to work every day and you don't feel the strong identification with the organization, you're going to choose to stay. So there are kind of all of these extraneous factors that could be completely external to the organization, like your partner's job, maybe your kids are in a great school district or something like that, that could lead people to stay, even if they don't necessarily want to. And then finally, we have normative commitment. Normative commitment is along the same lines as continuance commitment in that people could stay even if they don't necessarily love their jobs or necessarily want to stay in that particular job. But it's different in that normative commitment stems from a feeling of obligation to the organization. So when we have high normative commitment, this is where you're staying with the organization because you feel like you ought to, or because you feel like it's the right thing to do. And there are different ways that people can arrive at normative commitment. And this could just be sort of a general belief about work, right? You might have the idea that the way to be the best employee is that you just stay with one company for your entire career. It could also be you've been there for a really long time and you feel like that organization has invested so much in you. They've given you opportunities, they've trained you, they've helped develop you. So you owe it to them to stay and sort of reinvest in the organization. Now, this is something that's been shifting across generations, right? I think this long-term relationship with work in a particular organization is no longer the norm. It used to be that people stay with one company sort of for their entire careers, but we certainly don't see that these days. And then, of course, this was also affected by COVID and things like the Great Resignation, where people are also kind of jumping around from job to job and have much lower tenures within their jobs than we've seen before. But it is still possible that people feel this sense of obligation. And again, even if they don't like their jobs, they might stay. Now here, I know I've already said this, but I want to underscore that for these last two forms of commitment, for continuance commitment and normative commitment, we again have employees who are staying in the organization, but not necessarily because they want to be there. That means that we can't just monitor for something like turnover. We can't just monitor if people are quitting their jobs or if people are staying. and assume that if people aren't leaving, we don't have any problems in our organization and everyone is happy. That very well may not be the case, right? And it really underscores the importance of doing occasional attitude surveys with our employees to make sure that they are actually satisfied and that they have the most desirable form of commitment, which is affective commitment. Okay, we are through most of the meat of our content for this week. We've talked all about job satisfaction. We've talked about organizational commitment and summarized these different forms of commitment that people can have. And now I want to give you the briefest preview to the predictors and outcomes of job satisfaction. And this is going to be really brief because we are essentially covering the answer to this question for the entirety of the semester, right? I am going to tell you for all of the weeks to come what predicts job attitudes and how we can sort of facilitate improving job attitudes. But I hope today to start to answer the questions of how we can foster positive job attitudes among our employees and why that's worth the investment. Now, when we think about job attitudes, they are very complex and they require us to synthesize information about all of our feelings and all of our thoughts related to basically every aspect of our job. So it's probably not surprising then that almost everything you can think of can contribute to our job attitudes, and that job attitudes are simultaneously predicted by who we are and the environment in which we work. So starting with who we are, we see that things like our personality matter a lot for job attitudes. So some employees tend to be relatively satisfied across time, across positions, etc., sort of regardless of the circumstances, and some not so much, right? People who are prone to experiencing positive emotions are also among employees who are most satisfied. So we think about things like positive affectivity and extroversion as being really related to job attitudes. Then we also think about fit, right? The degree to which who you are as a person and the environment converge, right? So it's not always just about who you are, but how well that fits in with a particular environment. Then our job characteristics, which we just talked about, are really important. So we do have a lot of evidence showing that when we maximize those core job characteristics predicted by the job characteristics model, that we do see high job satisfaction. Things like organizational justice matter. So feeling like your organization is fair and treats you in a clear, transparent, and equitable way to other employees in the organization is really key for satisfaction and commitment. The relationships that we have at work are also really important. If we have these positive and supportive relationships, we have more positive job attitudes. Whereas if we experience hostility or derogation, discrimination, mistreatment, etc., from the people we work with or even our customers, that's going to really detract from our job attitudes. Stress is exceedingly important. If we are stressed out every second that we're on the job, we're going to have low job attitudes. And then things like work-life balance, or the degree to which work, at least in our own perception, interferes with our ability to be a whole person. Then I also wanted to draw attention to one specific predictor, which is something we're not going to talk about as much explicitly throughout the semester, but is something that is really important to highlight here as a tangible action that employers can engage in for their employees to maximize their commitment, which is employees are more committed when employers are committed to them. So this is a reciprocal process. If you want organizations to demonstrate this loyalty and attachment to you, you have to show that same loyalty and attachment to them. And we tend to call this construct perceived organizational support. So the degree to which employees perceive that their organization supports them both instrumentally and emotionally. And we can achieve this by facilitating social bonds, so making sure that employees are well integrated into the social structure of the organization, providing good salaries and benefits, and making sure we're meeting employee needs. Investing in employee development, give them positive feedback, give them promotion opportunities, give them training and development opportunities, and make sure we are demonstrating that we care about their growth. And then also figuring out what's wrong. So we do need to periodically check in and see what's going wrong that maybe we're not aware of or we don't see behind the scenes. Is there mistreatment happening? Is there harassment happening? Are people not getting resources that they need? Is there an important piece of equipment that's broken that hasn't been fixed that we're not aware of, right? Seek employee feedback. Then we're going to shift a little bit into talking about the outcomes of job attitudes. And again, this is building the case that we should invest in improving job attitudes. And here, when we think about basically all of the key outcomes we could possibly care about as organizations, as HR professionals working within organizations, we see that job attitudes have a pretty strong relationship with all of those outcomes. So when people are satisfied and committed, we see decreased turnover and absenteeism, meaning they're less likely to leave the organization. They're less likely to do things like come to work late, leave early, skip out of meetings, all of those kinds of things. We also see increased OCB. We'll talk about what OCB is at length next week, but it stands for Organizational Citizenship Behaviors. And these are elective positive behaviors that employees can engage in. They don't have to, but they can choose to sort of go the extra mile. When employees are satisfied and committed, they're more likely to do that. We also see that this trickles down to customers. So when our employees are satisfied, our customers are more satisfied. Also, we see that this translates some boundaries, or transverses some boundaries, I should say, meaning that when we're happier at work, we're also happier with our lives. We also have better health. We're happier and healthier people broadly when our jobs are going well. And we also see that firms perform better when we have employees who have high job satisfaction and job commitment. Okay, so you might have noticed that there's something missing from that list that I just put up on the last slide. And the thing that's missing is task performance, which is usually the outcome that we're most interested in predicting across all of organizational behavior. So really, the relationship between job satisfaction and job performance has just been a little bit more complicated than people expected it to be. And we still do see that there's a relationship between job satisfaction and job performance, but it's not as strong as what we would have anticipated. Part of why we anticipate this relationship to be so strong is because there's this underlying lay belief, or even this classic adage that we tend to hear, that a happy worker is a productive worker. But when we actually look at the relationship pulling from recent meta-analyses, we see that the relationship between job satisfaction and job performance is actually only about a 0.3. So if you think back to what we talked about last week with correlations, correlations can range from 0 to 1, either positive or negative. And so a 0.3 relationship really isn't all that strong. So people have been really interested in trying to figure out why this relationship isn't as strong as we think it is, when people really have this kind of gut belief that if we make our employees happier, then they're going to perform better. Now, there's also another issue that is a little bit unclear with this relationship, and that's the direction of the relationship. And here we have those classic issues with correlations where we can't say the causal order of two variables. So it's possible that when employees are happier, when they're more satisfied at work, they perform better. But it's also possible that when we perform better at work, that makes us more satisfied with our jobs, or that makes us happier. And both of these have kind of received some empirical support, some support in research evidence, so that we see that people do become more satisfied with their positions when they perform better, but they also perform better when they're more satisfied with their positions. But we tend to see more support for the second. So we do tend to see more support for job satisfaction, leading to increased performance in the future. Now, if you also remember from last week, I told you that we were going to come back to the term validity, and that validity would be really important in sort of figuring out some common debates in the literature. And this is one area where validity is incredibly important. So here, again, the adage or the expectation is that happier employees are more productive. But job satisfaction isn't just happiness, right? And the way that we've defined it here, it is kind of affective, right? Feelings matter, but it's also very cognitive. It's also about how we appraise our jobs and all the things that we think to be true of our jobs. So maybe this just isn't the right relationship. And when we look at the relationship between just sort of a purely emotional measure of happiness felt on the job, we see that that relationship is more strongly related to performance. We see that happiness is more strongly related to performance as compared to satisfaction, which is again very cognitively laden. So just a point of clarity here, this is a big debate in the field. You might see that, there's a 0.3 relationship and think, okay, job satisfaction is not key for improving performance. I would certainly not go that far. It is still important for improving performance, but we may also need to really focus on how our employees feel on the job in order to get that boost in performance that we're really looking for.